Hello, everyone. It's William with the 1921 video series. My dogs have been riled up today, so hopefully they won't interrupt. We're up to, I believe this is part 7 of the long diary entry for 31st January 1921. But at any rate, I'll make sure that the title is accurate, whether it's the 7th or the 8th, but I think it's the 7th. And we are up to page 64. So we'll start with personal feelings and events in his daily life, beginning on the next page, 65. But this is extraordinarily interesting and historically important, I think, text. So I'm really delighted with it. So as you know, if you've been watching the other videos, the previous videos from this long diary entry, Dmitri has formed this little intelligence gathering group called the Information Bureau under the overall the umbrella, you could say, of a group led by Alexander Trepov called the Russian Assembly. So the people around Trepov were mainly people who'd been important figures in the government and at court. And the smaller group that Dmitri had gathered around himself were almost all generals. At the very least, they were all military men. One of them was, like him, a captain, but the rest were generals. So in yesterday's portion, he was informing us what his group had learned about the mood within Russia of soldiers and officers in the Red Army on the one hand, and the Narod, the folk, the peasantry on the other hand. So I mentioned in my video on the 11th of September 1907 today that peasants made up a huge percentage of the Russian population. I mean, beyond huge, because they were something like 93 or 94% of the Russian population. And then you had this little island on top of that wasn't just aristocrats and royalty or even minor nobility. It was all educated people. You know, even those who were earning a middle-class income and were junior civil servants, all middle-class people, and even urban factory workers who hadn't migrated from the countryside were in this little bubble of less than 10% of the population at the top. And so, yeah, just bear that in mind when we talk about the Russian Narod. So, the people, the common people. All right, so today he's going to give us more information about the information that they've been able to gather, and also about how that information should ideally be implemented, and what are the realistic explanation or the expectations as he sees them for the future. And he's a pretty smart fellow, our friend. You know, he's really been misjudged because he was a smart fellow, he was a strategic thinker, he was very interested in everything that was going on around him. And the only problem with that was that he was not a leader. And he conceived of himself as a leader. So, yeah, you know, oftentimes his attempts to do something meaningful within this sphere that he loved so much of politics was, these attempts were failures, one after another, because, I think, partly because of this misconception he had of himself as being a leader or a potential leader. And not everybody is. You can be extremely intelligent and well-informed and strategic in your thinking and yet not have that talent for leadership itself. Okay, so let's dive in. The general opinion is that the movement can only succeed in the capitals, whence in a very short time it will spread throughout Russia. But to act from the peripheries will only destroy the affair and strengthen the position of the Soviet government. The condition of the Soviet is apparently very bad. Transportation is constantly getting worse, and thus the towns are gradually dying. There is very little food because the peasants don't have grain. The words spoken to me by Raleigh 2 months ago have now been confirmed. He arrived with the conviction that Tsarist Russia is dead. The Russia of the commissars is dying, but the Russia of the peasants will come. That's exactly what we're now hearing. Among the Russian people, there's an awakening of national sentiment, and they want a new and strong government. But if it is established against their will, they will not accept it because nobody will trust it. All that information corresponds completely with my personal thoughts, which instinctively dominated my thinking in the spring and summer of last year. I wrote about them last year in my diaries. All right, so that's Dmitry, and let me just confirm going forward that he's not lying or exaggerating. He did write about these things in his diaries the previous year, the spring and summer of the previous year, and I do think he had very good instincts when it came to taking a realistic view of what was going on in Russia. I mean, he got caught up in the excitement, like so many other people did, of the Civil War. And for a while, it did indeed look like things were going very well. And he's still sort of in this thrall to this idea that there will be a future monarch and that he will in fact be that monarch. But we all have our wishful thinking. But he wasn't the kind of person to accept rumors and other things as being true. Okay. So all this makes me think about what I have learned from my friend and student, and I'm also a student of his, in Paris, Alfred Bruyère. He's a young man of 21, but I've learned a tremendous amount from him. And one of the things he's undertaken to do, not very successfully, I'm afraid, because I'm just not diligent enough, is to teach me how to play chess. And I've always been one of those people who, when he plays chess, he just has the mindset of taking as many pieces as possible and playing very aggressively and just sort of pushing blindly forward. And then when he loses, saying, well, I'm just not any good at this game, I just don't have the right kind of brain for it. And, to a certain extent that may be true, but Alfred has taught me that it's really stupid to think that you're not good at anything when you've never tried to learn it. And when you think that people are just either born good at it or not born good at it. And so he's told me that the 3 principles in chess for being a strategic player are: 1, to control the center; 2, to develop your pieces; and 3, to protect your king. And I'd like to think about how that can be applied to other things. In a general sense and in a specific sense with respect to my own life. Well, in this instance, if we're to apply those principles to Russia and to the Civil War, they couldn't protect their king, could they? Because their king was already gone, and there was no clear line on who the next king would be, as much as Dmitri would have liked to have seen that, as everybody wanted him. So there was no king to protect. So when that sort of thing happens, you have to have a principle going forward. And Dmitri said that you're going to protect as the sort of king in the abstract. In Dmitri's opinion, that was the Orthodox faith. But anyway, let's not go into that. Develop your pieces. Yeah, use what resources you have. Don't keep them in reserve or sit on them, or just leave them. Develop them. Good advice. But the main one that comes into play here is control the center. And Dmitri is absolutely right about that. In the Civil War, the various troops under Kolchak, Denikin, then Wrangel, and Yudenich were all acting from the peripheries. Understandable, since they had had to flee the capitals and go out to the Caucasus and go south, north, and east. But they were not going to succeed in that way. They had to take the capitals, and there was a real attempt to march on Petrograd, both earlier under the provisional government when Kornilov was marching on the capital, General Kornilov, and during the Civil War. I think it was Yudenich, I could be wrong, who made the big push on Petrograd and didn't make it made it close, but didn't make it all the way there before they were repulsed by the Red Army. But anyway, quite true. It wasn't going to work from the peripheries, and it didn't work from the peripheries, and Hitler should have learned that lesson, that instead of giving up on taking Moscow and St. Petersburg and deciding to divert all his troops to trying to race to the oil fields in Baku and bypassing the two capitals. Yeah, who knows? God forbid he might have succeeded if he'd managed to take at least one of the two capitals. But working from the peripheries is just not, it's just not a viable option. Maybe some of you can think of some instances where it was a viable option, and you can let me know about that, but I still maintain that Alfred's rule is correct, this chess rule of controlling the center. All right, so going more into details, transportation. Transportation is constantly getting worse. Transportation was one of the reasons why Russia lost the First World War. Already there was a huge strain on trains and this same problem of transporting food to the people that needed it. There weren't enough trains for the to transport troops and military items on the one hand, and also food on the other. So the Soviets have inherited this problem. And I decided today to switch to Soviet instead of Soviet, because Soviet is what he means, the Central Soviet government. So he's hearing that the Soviet government is actually in very bad shape. And yeah, in some ways it really was, even though it had prevailed in the Civil War. And the big problem is getting food to people. So Dmitri says that the towns are gradually dying, and that there's very little food because the peasants don't have grain. So they don't have seed grain, they don't have food grain, and I don't know if the Soviets were exporting grain. I'm not sure about that at this point, if they had trade agreements and if they were able to export grain. That certainly, came into play under Stalin, that grain was exported and the Ukraine was starved. and something like 30 million people, I think, died in that sort of artificially induced famine. But in this case, food isn't reaching the people who need it, and Dmitry points to it being a transportation problem. Well, Trepov would have known a lot about that, because Trepov had actually been, before he briefly became prime minister of Tsarist Russia, he was the transportation minister. But anyway, when I decided I would just take a quick look online, just what Wikipedia said about whether there was famine in Russia in 1921, and boy, I was astounded. It's embarrassing that I didn't know this, but there was a huge famine beginning in the spring of 1921 and stretching on through 1922. So Dmitry is writing about this before it has actually begun, but all the signs are pointing in that direction. I don't think this was some brilliant intuition on his part. It's probably something that Trepov was talking about. But so there was this horrible famine beginning in spring 1921. Wikipedia says it killed an estimated 5 million people and primarily affected the Volga and the Ural River regions. And many of the starving resorted to cannibalism. Apparently, this is something that has been confirmed. It happened from time to time. It happened in Maoist China, and apparently it happened here in this big famine of 1921-1922 in Soviet Russia. And of course, it brought with it diseases. Wikipedia lists cholera, typhus, and I'm sure, that tuberculosis surged as well. All right, anyway, so that's about to happen. And people like Dmitry are seeing the writing on the wall about that. And of course it puts the government in a weak position going forward. But now here's where things really get interesting. So we talked before when Dmitry had first informed us about his creation of this information bureau, as he called it. We talked before about espionage, and that this was basically an intelligence gathering, a tiny intelligence gathering bureau that he had created by bringing these various people into the group whom he judged to have useful connections, both within Russia and outside of Russia, in Germany and France. Hold on one second. Sorry, this is a constant aggravation in my life. One of the best things about being at Schatzalp in the Alps is not having the constant noise. There's a almost deaf member of the family who is also a TV addict, and good Lord, I won't get into that, or that will become a diatribe. Anyway, what was I talking about? Espionage. So, I mentioned that Paul Alinsky had told me, jokingly, that some people had wondered if his father was actually an MI6 operative. And he laughed at that idea, and I'm sure he was quite right to laugh at that idea, that Dmitry was not on the payroll, I shouldn't say not on the payroll, but wasn't an actual MI6 operative. But, there is a big question as to what his ties to the world of British intelligence were, and maybe French intelligence. Well, we know that these undercover police officers were following him around in Paris. And apparently they wanted to see what he was up to from, on the political end of the spectrum. And for them, it was pretty much a shoulder shrug. They probably thought of all of these monarchist White Russian organizations as being pretty much Yeah, pretty much just pie in the sky, nothing to. Oh, God, that distracts me so much. I'm sorry. Um, Nothing to worry about. So all they wrote about was him going to brothels. But, I wonder. I really do, because I'd forgotten this Raleigh fellow, and I'd also forgotten that he had met with Sidney Riley at a hotel room in Piccadilly, in London, in 1919. And any of you who are familiar with James Bond, which I think we all are, and have in, in fact, read up a little on James Bond, will know that Sidney Riley was actually the model for James Bond. And he is sometimes called the ace of spies, and sometimes called a super spy, a British super spy. Well, he was actually a Russian Jew. And yeah, so he and Dmitri had this get together in a hotel room in Piccadilly. And Dmitri doesn't say what they talked about or what came of that, but wouldn't we all love to know? So now we have another person who's brought up who almost definitely was a spy. And this was this fellow called Raleigh. Dmitri spells it R-A-L-I phonetically, but of course that was not the spelling. R-A-L-E-I-G-H. And I haven't been able to find out a lot of information about him. So he wasn't like Sidney Riley. He wasn't someone who left such a trail of information and was so celebrated that he has a Wikipedia article, and if you look into espionage at all in the 20th century, you're going to come across him right away. Maybe there is stuff about Colonel Raleigh that's out there. He used this rank of colonel, but, you would have to do more digging. Okay, so who was Colonel Raleigh? He was a Ukrainian Jew from Odessa who claimed to be Irish and had, proclaimed his loyalty to the British Crown, despite his claim to being Irish. So he'd been in the U.S. during the war. He had something to do with war materials. That was part of his function in the U.S. And then in December 1919, he was back in London, and he claimed to be at the War Office, employed at the War Office. And he claimed to be a friend of Churchill's. So these are claims that he made to Dmitri, I believe. And Dmitri noted that he could often be seen at the Ritz, dressed in an aviator's uniform and surrounded by, as Dmitri described them, serious-looking men. So the Ritz, both in London and Paris, was a focus of Dmitri's life. He lived for a while at the Ritz in London. He didn't live at the Ritz in Paris, but even when he wasn't living at the Ritz in Paris or London, he was gravitating to the Ritz because so many of his friends also sort of would go there for tea and lunch and dinner. And so anyway, Colonel Raleigh would turn up in an aviator's uniform at the Ritz, surrounded by serious-looking men. One would assume that he could not wear a real British aviator's uniform out in public if he didn't have some legitimate claim to it. One would assume that he would be, arrested if he were to do that. Maybe not. I have no idea. But what else does Dmitri tell us about him? Nothing substantive. Substantive? Anyway, just physical appearance. He was clean-shaven. He had a very intelligent but unsympathetic face. His eyes were bulging and inflamed. His hair was jet black and slicked down with pomade. Okay, so kind of a shady-looking character, but there could have been some anti-Semitism with that. Although I don't remember if Dmitri knew that he wasn't Irish. I think Dmitri knew that. Anyway, he and Dmitri were getting together. There was only the one meeting that we know about with Sidney Reilly, but there were quite a few meetings with Colonel Raleigh. And I also know that Colonel Raleigh had other associates. Galievsky, Dmitri's friend and fellow member of the Information Bureau, was also had connections to Raleigh. And this fellow Karol, Karol, Karol Yaroshinsky, who I think was Polish, he was Roman Catholic. And Dmitri describes him as a big Russian financier, and he was a friend of Maria's. But even more interesting than that was the fact that he actually sent Dmitri 50,000 rubles while Dmitri was in Tehran. And it was delivered by an Englishman called Leach. Well, unfortunately for Dmitri, 50,000 rubles didn't end up amounting to a hill of beans, and he had to go into debt in Tehran and get loans and rely on Charles Marling to pay his expenses and so on and so forth. So getting 50,000 rubles sent to him from Yaroshinsky was not a big windfall, as it turned out. Yaroshinsky was a man who blamed the Russian Revolution very firmly on the German General Staff and Deutsche Bank. So he put more emphasis on that than the usual Jewish / Freemason cabal causing the Russian Revolution. He really blamed the Germans for the Russian Revolution. And he also was an associate of both Dmitri's and of Colonel Raleigh's. Okay, and then finally you have Halford John Mackinder, who was a man of great renown, an intellectual, a professor, and a founding father of both geopolitics and geostrategy. He was a professor, or at least, what do they call them before they become professors? A reader at both Oxford and the London School of Economics. And he very much was in favor of the British government supporting the Tsarist troops, the white troops, during the Civil War. And in fact, he was appointed the British High Commissioner to South Russia, to the government that had been established there by Denikin in 1919, when it still looked as though the white troops had a chance of prevailing against the Bolsheviks, and it also still looked like the British were still considering having intervening militarily on the side of the white troops. So and he was also somebody that had connections with both Dmitri and with Colonel Raleigh. So this kind of elevates Dmitri to a whole, a much higher league, than people usually give him credit for, far above what people usually give him credit for. As shady as some of these people may be, they're absolutely serious people, and they're absolutely people who are involved in this new version of the Great Game, with Russia as a rogue state at that time, as a Bolshevik or Soviet state, that most I shouldn't say, because I don't know when Britain, for instance, acknowledged Soviet Russia as a legitimate state, a legitimate government. But having forgotten about this and looking at it now, I think absolutely these people were involved in intelligence, and absolutely they were looking at Dmitri as, on the one hand, the most likely next Tsar of Russia, if there was going to be one, and on the other hand, the Romanov that they most wanted contact with, that they took the most seriously. I mean, Nikolai Nikolaevich had made it clear that he was bowing out. And the Vladimirovich brothers were all just a bunch of sad sack do-nothings. And here's where I'm going to forcefully state my own opinion on that. So apologies if I offend anyone. But in my opinion, they were all lost causes. And I think if I had been in British intelligence at that time, or even later, after Cyril had proclaimed himself emperor in exile, my opinion would have been that this guy he's never going to do anything. He's just, he's just this sort of sad sack who has this terribly ambitious wife who's behind all of this, pushing him to call himself the emperor of Russia and all this other stuff. And it doesn't help matters the fact that she herself is very much German leaning. So yeah, Dmitri was their man, apparently. And this is, opening up a whole new vista for me. I'm thinking about it in terms of course, my novel, but also, more conventionally with respect to history, about whether more information could be dug up about that. And I don't want to sound too excited, because the fact of the matter is that if this was the status quo in 1921, it fizzled. And it fizzled quickly. As far as there being any illusion left that Dmitri was going to be the emperor in exile, that fizzled very quickly. And in fact, we're going to see that in a relatively quick period of time in the diary entries. And Dmitri gets so discouraged and depressed that he just runs off with Coco Chanel, and that was his way of dealing with it. But anyway, I shouldn't get so far ahead. Anyway, the question nonetheless does remain, was he, over the years that followed, intermittently, did he continue to have contact with British intelligence? And did he ever receive any payment for that contact? And was it conscious? Was it conscious if he was being... if he was a resource for British intelligence, was he a conscious resource? And I remember David Chavchavadze, Grand Duke Georgy Mikhailovich's grandson, saying that, and he was a career CIA agent, and mostly in South America, and he said, no, it's a misnomer to talk about CIA agents, which I've just done. David would not be happy with me, because we were CIA officers. The people who are in the employ and who are, members of the CIA are CIA officers, and the people we recruit are called agents. So in this case, you could say that Dmitri would have been a British intelligence agent, rather than, an asset. Certainly, I would say he was an asset, but I don't know. An agent would have been a conscious recruit providing information. But, there would have come a time when Dmitri just didn't have any information to provide. So, yeah, I'm really not sure about that. And he certainly had very much a love-hate relationship with Britain. And then he would end up falling under the sway of Alexander Kazembek in the 30s and joining this Young Russia movement. So I guess he could have given them information about that. Although, once again, like almost all of these emigre monarchist organizations that sprang up, they were almost all very quixotic. Let us say. They were tilting at windmills. But anyway, I enjoy this topic so much that I have now babbled on for 35 minutes. And and we will be getting to the more personal side of things, I think, in the next video. As I said, we're up to page 64 now, and he turns to his own personal life beginning on page 65. So we're very close. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye.